John Bachar.
John Bachar is considered to be the best solo free climber in the world.
This is what John lives for. This is where he belongs. No ropes, no pitons, just hands, shoes, and a bag of chalk for grip. To the other climbers, John just may be the best free climber that ever lived.
This is a story about ethics.
I'd rather do something in good style than fudge my way up it, you know. I'd rather leave it alone if I can't do it in a certain style.
About death-defying free solos.
So I knew the kind of things that he was capable of doing, and it didn't surprise me that he did it, but my hat was off because he did do it.
And about how those two concepts would bring one man to the pinnacle of the climbing world until it all came crashing down. In the world of rock climbing, few people can match the legacy of John Bachar. Who was this legendary figure who pursued the dangerous art of free soloing? What motivated him to risk his life? And how is it that Bachar would go from one of the top climbers in the world to vandalizing routes, picking fights with friends, and becoming so embroiled in controversy that he eventually left the sport? Bachar's story began in the early 1970s. John grew up in California and would go bouldering at the local hotspot of Stony Point. It was there that he met other young climbers like John Long, Ron Kalk, and John Yablonsky, and together, their hobby of climbing blossomed into a full-blown obsession. It didn't take long for Bachar to start free soloing, the art of climbing without a rope. According to Moja Gear, with encouragement from fellow stonemaster John Long in the early 1970s, Bachar experienced his first soloing escapade on Double Cross 5.7+. Soon, Bachar was lighting the climbing world on fire with a series of hard, daring free solos, and a legendary air began to build around him. Listen to author Jeff Smoot describe his first encounter with John Bachar. He started climbing, setting his fingertips in the thin crack, towing himself on barely discernible ripples and undulations in the rock. Dave and I stood mesmerized, watching as he climbed upward perfectly, without emotion, without apparent effort, as if the force of gravity had become momentarily suspended to allow his passage there. "Do you know who that was?" Dave asked reverently. "That was John Bachar. That was God." I love this passage because it shows the kind of status Bachar had by the mid-70s. He was almost a myth, this larger-than-life figure who inspired a generation of climbers, and he would soon make a statement on the international stage that solidified his legend. In 1981, Bachar went on an international climbing trip, visiting some of Europe's most famous destinations. Most notably, he went to the Frankenjura, a Mecca climbing destination in Germany, where, as described by Smoot in the book Hangdog Days, Bachar was an instant sensation among the German climbers as he did a first ascent of what could have been the hardest route in Europe at the time. This trip gained Bachar international recognition for his strength and bravery, but soon, things would take a turn for the worse for the now legendary soloist. Before we can talk about that though, we need to talk about today's sponsor, Magic Spoon. Magic Spoon is your classic cereal, reinvented to have high protein, low carbs, and zero sugar while also being keto and gluten friendly. I was looking for something to help with my post-training snacks, so I was pretty stoked when Magic Spoon sent me a sample of their variety pack. They have 4 flavors: cocoa, fruity, frosted, and peanut butter. Maybe it's just nostalgia, but fruity is honestly my favorite, although they're all honestly pretty good. I'm not a huge breakfast person, but I really like Magic Spoon because it's a filling and healthy snack that I can have anywhere throughout the day, and it helps me keep my energy up for school or climbing. You can use the link below to get your own variety pack, and either use the code CRAG or order through magicspoon.com/Crag for $5 off your order. Magic Spoon is so confident that they offer no questions asked refunds if you're not 100% happy with your order, so use the link below or go to magicspoon.com/Crag for $5 off. To understand why things would eventually take a turn for the worse for Bachar, you need to understand a little bit about climbing ethics. John Bachar had strong views about the way things should be climbed. According to legendary climber Lynn Hill, quote, "John was a perfectionist and climbing was his means of achieving mastery." To Bachar, the idea of mastery required a level of consequence. In Hangdog Days, Jeff Smoot outlines how Bachar thought that the best way to climb a route was to do it from the ground up, without any information on the route, preferably without a rope. Lynn Hill, similarly, says that John wanted to push himself on the most demanding climbs imaginable with minimal reliance on equipment. The problem was, not everyone agreed with Bachar. According to the Chicago Tribune, by the 80s, most climbers no longer considered solo climbing the ultimate refinement of their sport. They preferred mastering the sheer gymnastic difficulty of hard-roped climbs. Especially in Europe, a new type of climbing was starting to take place. In this new style, which would become known as sport climbing, Europeans would rappel down a route and drill bolts into the rock, often less than 10 feet apart, almost completely eliminating the danger of the climb. They would also do what's known as hangdogging, which is hanging on their rope in order to practice a series of moves. This allowed them to push the physical level of climbing difficulty to never-before-seen heights. These techniques were antithetical to many of Bachar's beliefs. The Tribune goes on to outline that, by Bachar's philosophy, climbing is as much a mental game as a physical one. Rappelling, bolting, cleaning, scouting, and rehearsing a route before the actual climb rips out the dangerous heart of the sport. A real climber starts at the bottom of a cliff. Uncertainty is his greatest enemy. When Bachar went to Europe in the 1980s, he saw sport climbing starting to gain popularity, and according to Jeff Smoot, these tactics offended him. When he got home, Bachar was on a mission. Smoot says that, quote, after returning to America, as if in reaction to what he had observed, Bachar embarked on a series of unprecedentedly bold free solos and first ascents. It was as if he was trying to show that the European ethic of rappel bolting wasn't necessary to push the limit of climbing. This spree further built up the myth of John Bachar, culminating in a legendary statement. In late 1981, at what could be the pinnacle of his career, Bachar pinned a note to a bulletin board in Yosemite. He was offering a $10,000 reward for anyone who could follow him for a day of climbing. One climber described that taking Bachar up on this offer would have involved, quote, following him up difficult routes that were barely protected or not at all, if he even bothered to rope up. It would be tantamount to suicide. The note sat untouched for months. Not a single climber took him up on the offer. Bachar was too strong, the routes he did were too dangerous for anyone to dream of keeping up with him. According to Smoot, the note had its desired effect. It solidified Bachar's status as the undisputed greatest rock climber of his generation. Rock and Ice says that 1981 was Bachar's high water mark, and I agree. The note incident was the peak of John Bachar's myth. For a single, undisputed moment, he was the best rock climber alive on the planet. Stronger, smoother, bolder than anyone else. But things would soon take a turn. The problem was, while Bachar stayed firm in his ethics, the majority of the climbing world was moving in a different direction. Not long after the note incident, Europeans began to visit America on climbing trips of their own. Strengthened by years of sport climbing, these next-generation athletes began ticking off routes at a level of difficulty that none of the American climbers could keep up with. Soon, people began to turn their backs on the traditional ethics that Bachar preached. According to Rock and Ice, one by one, the lure of the new game and its super hard numbers pulled them away until Bachar almost became the lone voice of traditional style. Even Kalk, Bachar's former climbing partner and close friend, began sport climbing in Yosemite after an eye-opening trip to Europe. Bachar was stunned but stood his ground. It was like boom, he says. I was alone. I didn't have a partner like Kalk to climb with. When these new school ethics came to Yosemite, Bachar went on the offensive. Speaking of this next period in his life, friend and fellow climber Jerry Moffat said, Bachar had been going through a bad time back then. The nature of climbing, always so precious to him, was changing. He became entrenched, began to lose friendships, and perhaps perspective. First, there was a boulder problem named The Force, where local climber Mark Chapman used a tiny speck of glue to reinforce a loose hold. Bachar, claiming that the glue was unnatural, took a crowbar to the hold, pulling it clean off. Jerry Moffat says, quote, John destroyed the problem. The force was changed utterly, nowhere near the route it once was. Not long after, Bachar chopped the bolts off a route that Chapman and Ron Kalk had been working on. Mark Chapman confronted Bachar about this. According to Rock and Ice, Chapman stepped up and told Bachar that he would, quote, kick your ass if he ever chopped his bolts again. Bachar replied that there was no point in waiting and to go ahead and punch me. I was shocked, says Chapman, and when he said it again, a switch just went off and I hit him. The punch landed on Bachar's neck. My left arm went numb and I went to the hospital, he says. That was the last straw. Bachar left Yosemite altogether, taking up climbing in the nearby Owens River Gorge. For a brief moment, he felt that he had a little piece of paradise away from all the new school climbers, but this didn't last long. Soon, more and more people began showing up. I swear, said Bachar in an interview, within 6 months there were 100 new routes and they were all done on rappel. Increasingly upset, Bachar once showed up at the gorge, pointed his ghetto blaster right up the wall, cranked it to full volume, and began soloing Klingon 512. This climber chick came over to me, he says, and asked me if I could turn the music down. I said, you know what? You guys got rap bolts, I got rap music. I was pretty off. I'd just been through the same thing in Tuolumne. I was like, where do I have to go? Mars? Where he had once been a legend, Bachar now felt ostracized. The article goes on. For several years, he couldn't even bring himself to visit the valley. Worn by nearly 2 decades of high-level climbing and burned by the new attitude that had no place for him, Bachar threw himself into snowboarding, golf, and playing his sax, and for practical purposes, vaporized from the climbing scene. To me, this is the fall of John Bachar. This legendary figure who once stood on top of the world had been pushed away as the sport moved into a new era. He went from being the greatest climber on the planet to blasting music and picking fights with friends over concerns of whether or not a bolt should be put into rock, but that impression of Bachar is not how he's ultimately remembered. On July 6th, 2009, John Bachar slipped and fell while soloing a route near his home in Mammoth Lakes, California. He was rushed to the hospital but proclaimed dead shortly afterwards. Speaking about this tragedy, author Jeff Smoot said, John Bachar's death did not surprise me. I accepted it with a grim admiration. It was part of the game he chose to play. He was supposed to die that way. An ordinary death would not have befitted this legend. I like that quote not just for the sentiment, but also because it shows how Bachar is remembered in the climbing community despite all the controversy. In 1991, Steve Schneider wrote in an article that Bachar, quote, traded friendships for ethics and had few comrades to turn to. That may have been true at the time, but the love that the wider climbing community has for Bachar never faded. Rock and Ice says that after a car crash in 2006, climbers across the nation flooded him with get well emails and cards and hosted fundraisers to help offset his mountain of medical bills. That shows how John is remembered. He had his controversial moments, sure, but Bachar still stands today as one of the most legendary and revered members of the sport. John Gill, the father of American bouldering, described Bachar as Hermes with wings on his feet. Fellow free soloist Peter Croft said Yosemite was the place, Bachar was the guy, and that makes him more than just a climber. To me, though, it's John Long who first encouraged him to solo all those years ago, who put it best when he said, "There has never been anyone like John Bachar, and there never will be again."
Enjoyed that video? I bet you'll love this one. Go on, click it.